Hello, sixth grade. It's time for Blanket Bible Monday. When we left off Blanket Bible Monday last week, we had just finished the book of Exodus. The ending of the book of Exodus is bittersweet. It's bitter because of the sin of the golden calf, that the people had this beautiful covenant with God. They had been restored into God's family, and they broke the covenant. It's also bitter because they are freed from slavery in Egypt, but they're not yet in the promised land. They're in the wilderness. But it's sweet because now they have the tabernacle, and God's presence is in the tabernacle, signified by the cloud that has come down and rested on the tabernacle. So the end of Exodus is bittersweet. In the children's Bible, the next story we have is from the book of Numbers. But there's actually a book between Exodus and Numbers that I wanted to take a look at for a minute. And that book is Leviticus. Leviticus is a book that a lot of people don't read. In fact, I think there are only 2 passages from Leviticus that make it into the lectionary cycle that we ever even hear at Mass. And that's because Leviticus is a book of laws, and laws don't make for very fun reading. And a lot of those laws don't apply to us today anymore in the New Covenant, although some of them do. We'll talk about that in a minute. First, why is it called Leviticus? It's called Leviticus because that means pertaining to the Levites. And the Levites, as you know, are priests. So, because so many of the laws are about sacrifices, the different kinds of sacrifices and how to make them, and the priests and ordination of the priests, things like that, it's got the name Leviticus. Although there are laws in Leviticus for the whole people. So almost the whole book is speeches of God talking about these laws and regulations. The people are still at Mount Sinai, and Moses is speaking to them from the tabernacle. So the link with Exodus is very clear there. The main themes in the book of Leviticus are sacrifice, priesthood, cleanliness, and holiness. We don't follow the Jewish law, their ceremonial laws, for example, but these themes are very important for understanding Jesus and the sacrifice that he's made and the priesthood that he establishes that we partake in, and our own growth in holiness. So these themes are really important for Christians. One important theme of the book of Leviticus comes to us actually from St. Paul. The law was added on because of transgression. If you remember, the original covenant at Mount Sinai, the law, was basically the 10 Commandments, and a couple of chapters that sort of elaborated on the 10 Commandments, but not a lot of laws. But after the golden calf, a whole book of laws gets added on. It's a little bit like the more a class misbehaves, the more rules a teacher has to have for the behavior of the class. The law is added on because of transgression. And the more you're living the way you're called to live, the fewer laws you need. Just need the basics. So let's talk for a minute about sacrifice. It's an important topic. We've just been talking about the Mass as a sacrifice. So let's take a look at sacrifice in the Old Testament. And this is a really good place to look at it, because in Leviticus, God outlines for the people the different kinds of sacrifices. Peace offerings, cereal offerings. Cereal doesn't mean like Cheerios, it means grain, could be bread. Burnt offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. Some of these sacrifices, the Israelites, the Hebrew peoples, have been offering all along. We know that Cain and Abel offered sacrifices, and Noah and Abraham and Isaac all offered sacrifices. But the sin and the guilt offerings are added on now after the golden calf. So let's take a look at the notion of sacrifice for a minute. Sacrifice, in the book of Leviticus and in the Old Testament, the word actually used translates to gift or offering. So in the chapter that we just covered about the Mass, we talked about how in the Mass we make a gift, an offering to God, and that offering is given back to us and we partake of it. And that's why the Mass is a banquet, because we eat the gift that's been given and received back. So that idea of sacrifice as a gift comes from the Old Testament. The word sacrifice comes from the idea that the animal had to be slaughtered or burnt to be offered up to God. But it's a gift, and all sacrifices symbolize self-gift, right? I'm giving an animal or I'm giving bread, but it symbolizes that I'm giving myself to God. Even in the Old Testament, there was that understanding. So sacrifices did two things. They would express communion with God, and they would restore communion with God. Those would be the sin and guilt offerings. When you've broken communion with God, the sacrifice could restore that. And if you think about the Eucharist also does both those things. It expresses and builds up our communion with God, but it also restores our communion with God, right? Eucharist can forgive us of our venial sins. So all these notions of sacrifice from the Old Testament, right, are fulfilled and perfected in the sacrifice of the Eucharist. Okay, one more thing we want to talk about in the book of Leviticus is that there are a lot of laws about cleanliness and holiness. Okay, and here's why that's important. God is present to the Israelites in the tabernacle, right? That glory cloud is there, covering the tabernacle, indicating God's presence. And so you have to live in a way that's appropriate and suitable for being so close to the holiness of God. So God is present in the tabernacle. So the people must live in a way that is suitable for being so close to God. So there are laws about how to be holy, which includes both good moral actions and it includes right and proper worship. So there are going to be all kinds of rules about that, not just about sacrifices, but also about all the feasts, right? The Jews have their own liturgical year with different feasts throughout the year, just like Christians do. And the part of Leviticus that's still applicable to us today has to do with those laws about how we are supposed to treat each other. And two things that come from Leviticus that a lot of times people think come from the New Testament, but but they're very ancient from the Old Testament, is the law to love one's neighbor as oneself. And to be holy as God is holy. Okay, and you can see that this is all really important for us still today as Christians. We have God so close to us in the Eucharist, and so we have to live in a way that's suitable for being so close to God. And that has to do with both our actions and our worship, right? We don't approach the Eucharist if we're in a state of moral sin, right? We live a good moral life so that we are in a state that's appropriate for coming so close to God. And our worship also must be suitable for being so close to God. That's why in the last chapter we talked about things like appropriate dress and genuflecting and maintaining silence when we enter the church for Mass, because it's a recognition of how close we come to God. And so the book of Leviticus, even though it's a book that can admittedly be a little bit boring to read and that we don't hear a lot of in the lectionary, actually has a lot of themes that are really important for us as Christians and for understanding especially the Eucharist. Now, I'd like to give you a quick introduction to the book of Numbers, which we'll be reading next week and maybe the week after. So, why is the book of Numbers called Numbers? It's kind of an odd name. Numbers actually comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it refers to two numberings of the people. You know, like a census where you count the people, like the census that was taking place when Jesus was about to be born. Same thing. And the two numberings, one of them is going to be of the people who were actually part of the Exodus coming out of Egypt. And the second census or numbering is going to be of their children, 40 years later, grown up, right? Who will actually be the ones who enter the promised land. But in the Hebrew, if we look at the very opening words of the book in Hebrew, we get a different name for the book. The Hebrew name meant in the wilderness, which is a very good way to think about the book, because Numbers tells us the story of the people in the wilderness in the 38 years that it takes them to get from Sinai to the promised land. And it also kind of talks about them spiritually. They're spiritually in the wilderness too, as we'll see. There are a lot of rebellions against God in the book of Numbers. We could briefly compare Numbers to Exodus. We see, when we look at the Bible and we look at it as one book written by God, we see some beautiful parallelisms, things that didn't happen by chance, that you don't see as easily if you think they're just a bunch of different books written by a bunch of different people in different times. But if we think about the Bible as one book, these parallels are really lovely. So in the book of Exodus, to review a little bit, right, first we had the people in Egypt, and then we had them wandering in the wilderness, and then we had them at Sinai. In Numbers, we're going to have the people, first 10 chapters, they're at Sinai. Then they're wandering in the wilderness. And they end up on the plains of Moab, close to the promised land, ready to enter into the promised land. That's where they'll be at the end. That's where the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch, is going to take place, on the plains of Moab. And we see a lot of commonalities in this wandering in the wilderness, that the people grumble. We're hungry, we're thirsty, why did you bring us here? When are we going to get there? Right? The people grumble and rebel. And having trouble spelling. God provides manna, quail, water, right? We'll see some of those stories repeated in Numbers. God continually provides for them despite their grumbling. And also, we see some commonalities here, that God brings the people into covenant, right? The great covenant at Mount Sinai, and then the renewal and final form of that covenant in Deuteronomy is also going to be on the plains of Moab. So I guess we could say Numbers and Deuteronomy. Okay, so we see that same pattern. Now, let me get another color. I want to show you the overall pattern of the book of Numbers, because it's pretty cool. And it's kind of like the 2 points we can mark and divide up the book of Numbers, because it's really about the first generation, the generation that leaves Egypt, and the second generation, the generation that will enter the promised land. So we can take the first numbering, still having trouble spelling here, numbering of the first generation who went through the Red Sea, who left Egypt, and the second numbering of the second generation, people who will actually enter the promised land. Okay, and this numbering takes place while they're still at Sinai. So I'm going to draw a mountain here. Show you the geography. They're at Sinai, and in the middle, right, they're wandering. Maybe I'll stop here for a second. I'll show you a map. And then they end up on the plains of Moab. Note, that's flat. This is a mountain. Good things tend to happen on mountains. All the covenants in the Old Testament happen on mountains. Not so good things down there on the plain. That's going to kind of be a symbol of their rebelliousness on the plains of Moab. And the middle part, where all that wandering happens, I'll get yet another color. If you want to know what happens there, rebellions, actually 10 of them, and more laws. So remember, the law is added on because of transgression. So when they transgress, when they rebel, God responds with more laws for them. So this, if you keep this overall pattern in mind, then you can understand the book of Numbers, and you can understand how it moves us from where we leave off in Exodus at the foot of Mount Sinai to where Deuteronomy will take place on the plains of Moab. And the first generation, we know that's the generation of the golden calf. So we know how stubborn and how rebellious they can be. So we have some hope, and maybe the second generation, maybe the next generation will be more faithful to God. We're going to have to read Numbers to find out. Thanks for hanging in there. I know that was a little bit teachy this week, but I really wanted you to know a little bit about both of those books. Next week, I promise, we'll be back to reading from the Golden Bible. See you next week.